Thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to be presenting to you some recent work that I've been doing on the idea of fairness and market exchange, and in particular a kind of notion of procedural fairness in market exchange. And I'm going to sort of develop an analogy between fairness in democracy and fairness in markets. This is a project that's, again, fairly recent, and I'm learning a lot all the time, so I'm hoping to get a lot out of the discussion today as well. But let me start then with giving you a sort of a general picture of the project that I'm doing here. So the basic project here is to try to study the nature of economic justice, not just from a kind of macro level point of view, as you see, for example, in theories of distributive justice, where the focus is on how goods are distributed, but to some degree to focus in on questions about the nature of exchange itself and fairness in the process of exchange. So the idea is to look at a kind of procedural account of fair exchange. Again, analogously to the idea of a procedural account of democratic equality. But the idea here behind this procedural account is to sort of go beyond the two, what I take to be classical theories of fairness in economic exchange. One of them is going to be the idea that an exchange is fair to the extent that it avoids force and fraud. And the other one is, going back to Aristotle, the idea that an exchange is fair to the extent that there's equal exchange, namely there's equal value between the two, between what's given and what's taken. Okay. What I want to try to do is I'm going to say something about some of the problems that I take to be of these two different accounts of exchange, and I want to try to sketch an account of procedural justice that goes beyond those kinds of problems. So let me say something about some of these sort of classic views. I mean, one way to describe one kind of view about fairness is to say an exchange is fair to the extent that it's voluntary on the part of both parties. Okay, it's voluntary, therefore it's fair. Okay, now what that claim is depends, of course, on the notion of voluntariness that you use. And there, I'm going to just here for illustrative purposes just give two sort of the classic type accounts of what's a voluntary exchange. So one notion of involuntariness is the idea of something where if I exchange something with someone that I've coerced into engaging in the exchange. So your money or your life, so they give me their money, and that's a kind of exchange of some sort, or defrauded. So that's one kind of voluntary exchange, and the classic defender of this kind of view would be Robert Nozick, and maybe some versions of John Locke's account of exchange might come under this. The trouble with this account, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is that it fails in a fairly simple way, which is that it fails to capture the unfairness of certain kinds of exchanges. Namely, the classic example that goes back to Aquinas is the exchange of a rescue. So one person rescues another person, okay, and they could do it just by pulling them out of the water, say. But instead what they say is, I will pull you out of the water, but only if you give me the rest of your life's earnings, or at least 90% of the rest of your life's earnings, then I'll pull you out of the water. The person in the water is thinking, I either die or I have only 10% of my future earnings, and so they think it's a good deal. But intuitively, it looks like this is a deeply unfair exchange, okay? But there is no force or fraud in this account, at least if you understand force or fraud in a particular way. And so that notion of a fair exchange is, I think, fundamentally problematic. A second notion of fair exchange is going to come with the notion of involuntariness, where an action of yours is involuntary to the extent that you have no acceptable alternatives to that action. Okay, so you might think, if I pull somebody out of the water and it's either death or they pay me a certain amount of money, then the problem is, of course, they don't have any acceptable alternative to giving me a large amount of their income. Okay, so now the thought is, that's a way of responding to the criticism of the Nozick view. But the worry is that, of course, undermines the fairness of a lot of exchanges that seem fairly obviously fair and voluntary. Namely, for example, if a tow truck driver comes and picks you up in a snowstorm and asks you for $10 or $50 as a fee to pay it, or you can pay it later if you want, then the thought is going to be, well, you have no acceptable alternatives because, of course, you either die in the snowstorm and not pay the $50, or you pay. But the thought is going to be something like this view that exchange is fair only if it's voluntary. Looks like it's going where the notion of voluntariness means you have acceptable alternatives. Looks like it's going to say, well, all of these kinds of exchanges are unfair. Okay. In fact, all exchanges between all persons who are desperate, and even if you've got lots of people who are desperate, who are exchanging with each other, those are all unfair on this account because none of them have acceptable alternatives. So the idea of exchange being fair if and only if they're voluntary, however you understand the notion of the voluntary, seems like an unpromising candidate. The second notion that I want to sort of move beyond is the idea of fair exchange as exchange in terms of equal exchange. Namely, the traditional view, this comes from Aristotle, which is the idea is if what's given and what's taken are equal in value in some sense, then you've got a kind of fair exchange. And we see this view in Aristotle, we see it to some degree in Aquinas, we see it in Grotius, we see it also in maybe some distant version of it in Marx with the labor theory of value. Marx I don't think is resting a lot on this thesis, but this notion of equal exchange as the condition for fair exchange, I think, is quite common. The trouble is that, the idea that we have a common way of valuing objects is mostly been rejected. We live in a society where people have very different ways of valuing objects, and they have very different, they value things in very different ways. And so theories, the sort of classical economic theories, for example, which were grounded in certain kinds of value, like Adam Smith and Karl Marx on the labor theory of value, have been largely rejected at this point. And so the thought is going to be something like, such a view looks like it's problematic from the standpoint of it, when you have a sort of a pluralistic theory of value. The trouble is, there is one other way of attempting to save this conception of value, and that's the sort of neoclassical economic approach, which is the sort of marginalist view, okay? And the basic picture of the neoclassical approach is that the value of something is to be understood in terms of the price it gets in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, that's how we understand its value. And that's a way of making the notion of valuation compatible with very different ways of valuing things, so very different preferences. Whatever preferences people have, once you can define the price that something would secure in a market, we can determine what its value is. Now, I'm going to argue that that approach to value is also problematic, or at least that approach to fair exchange is problematic, because I think certain kinds of exchanges under perfectly competitive conditions can be quite unfair, and I'm going to talk about that later. But that's the basic picture. So you've got these two different views, the voluntariness and the exchange approach. The equal exchange approach, I think both of them failed. So the question is, what other picture of fair exchange can we develop here? And my idea, and I didn't really plan on this when I started thinking about exchange, although, I mean, since most of my work before that had been on democratic theory, people would say, well, yeah, everybody knew you were going to come to that conclusion. But the thought is going to be something like, is to try a democratic version of the notion of fair exchange. So let me motivate it just a little bit first. There are three different features of exchange which I think sort of motivate looking to democratic theory as a way of understanding the fairness of exchange. One is, if you think about the purpose of entering into agreements with other people, the thought is going to be something like, what you're doing when you're entering into an agreement is you're altering in some way the social world that you're living with that person. You're altering rights and duties, perhaps creating new rights and duties. You're transforming the social world in some small way. Now, of course, in some very simple exchanges, you're just changing the property rights, or who has what property rights. But in other exchanges, it's much more complex, partly because property rights are very complex. So what you're doing is you're trying to alter that social world. And in that respect, I want to say there's something analogous to the case of democratic citizenship. So when a person goes to think about their role as a democratic citizen and what they should be voting for and what they shouldn't be voting for, what they should be arguing for, and so on, is they're arguing for, in some sense, a rearrangement of rights and duties among persons in the society as a whole. Okay? And so, you change property rights, you have taxation and transfer, or you rearrange the markets in various ways, and so on. That's what citizens do. In that respect, the thought is going to be, it's similar to what's going on in the process of agreement making, except in the case of citizenship, you have a very small say and a very big rearrangement of rights and duties. In the case of agreements, you have a big say and a small rearrangement of rights and duties, a fairly marginal one. So the thought is going to be, in that respect, you've got something similar. In both cases, persons who are engaging in these activities are trying to reshape the social world that they're living in, reshape the relationships that they have with other people for certain kinds of purposes. Okay? A second kind of source of similarity here is that agreement making is a site of cooperation. That's, of course, the way we normally think of it. But it's also a site of conflict, okay? There are opposed interests in the case of agreement making just as much as shared interests. And the opposed interest, you can see, is very easy in the case of exchange. If you have, you have money and I have a car, the thought is going to be, well, what I want is to sell you the car for a lot more money, and you want to buy the car for a lot less money. Okay, preferably, in fact, you'd prefer to have the money and the car, and so would I. So that's in some sense, the exchange. The process of exchange is itself deeply conflictual in that sense, which is why I think, for example, On Liberty, Mill takes the whole activity of trade and takes it out of the realm of the private realm and says, no, this is a deeply social act, because he's talking about something where there are conflicting interests that are important here. So in that sense also, you've got some similarity with democracy. With democracy, you've got different people with different interests about how to organize society. And they have, of course, they have shared interests because they want some kind of common organization. But they have conflicting interests because they have different ways in which they want to have it done. Okay, so again, we have, I think, an important similarity. A third similarity here is that I think in the case of the rights that we have and the powers that we have in the market, these give a person a certain power to make changes in the world around them, okay? And the purpose of that is to make changes in accordance with their own judgments, okay? So there's a sense in which the thought is, you do things because it's important that you act on your own judgment. It's not, you don't just have some state of affairs and it's better to have a new state of affairs than the old state of affairs, and if some expert could figure it out, then they should impose that in you. The idea behind markets, for the most part, is that it's important for people to be advancing their own judgments about their own interests when they try to shape the world around them. And again, the thought is going to be, well, this is deeply analogous to democracy. In fact, I take this in some sense to be the common core of the idea of liberalism itself, which is that you give power to people to act on their own judgments, to make alterations in the world. And you do it, well, there are a number of different types of contexts, but there are democratic contexts, market contexts, and then there's sort of purely private contexts. You give people power to make decisions for themselves. Again, a very strong similarity, I think, with democratic decision-making. Now, so the thought is going to be something like, to the extent that what's going on in the case of markets is you've got exercises of power to shape the social world around you, okay? And to the extent that people are doing this in accordance with their own judgments, we can be guided by the idea that, well, the interests of persons are of equal significance. And so as a consequence, since what we're doing is when we're creating democracy or markets, we're organizing in terms of people having power to pursue those interests. What we do is we have a kind of focus on an egalitarian distribution of power instead of egalitarian distribution of the outcome. Because in the case of both democracy and in markets, we all have a lot of disagreement and conflict about the kind of outcomes that we want. Okay, so this is also kind of a way of trying to motivate the concern with the procedural dimension of economic exchange in addition to its outcome dimension, and again, analogous to the case of democracy. So that gives you some way of giving a sort of a motivation to it. Now, the idea here is that what a fair or just markets are going to do, if we take the democratic analogy seriously, is going to be giving each person a kind of global equal power understood in some way, and that's something we have to work out, to shape the social world through that market, and give them, again, a kind of equal power, just like the case of equal power in the case of democracy. Now, the notion of power, though, in the case of markets is quite different from the case of democracy. And that is, in the case of markets, the primary way of getting a handle on the idea of power is the idea of what's called the outside option. In other words, your power is commensurate with, a criterion for it is the extent to which you have other alternatives available to you. Okay, that's why you have if you look at the person who's drowning in a pool and the person who can save them, the power is much greater than the one in the pool because they have a set of options that are much more valuable to them, while the person who's drowning in the pool has a very bad set of options available to them. And so we can measure, in some sense, the power in terms of what happens when you don't enter into agreement. That's different from the case of democracy. What we have in the case of markets is we have something like bargaining, in some cases genuinely bargaining power, or in the case of perfectly competitive markets, I'll argue, something like bargaining power that we can look at and see as a way of assessing the egalitarian character of that market. Okay. So let me just, I'm going to put out this principle that I want to argue comes out of this notion. And it's what I call a global equal capacity. And it has two parts. The first part is kind of global equal cognitive conditions. Persons have, in other words, if the cognitive conditions are the kinds of information and understanding that you have and the resources for getting information, okay, with which to understand your interests and with which to understand your concerns and with which to understand how to realize them and what the implications of whatever agreements you enter into. Okay, so a person has very little capacity to the extent that they don't have those cognitive conditions. I mean, the most obvious case of this is the case of a person who signs a contract in a language they don't understand, which of course happens quite a bit in the United States. And they're often thrown out of court because the person didn't understand the contract. That's a very elementary lack of cognitive conditions. But presumably further lack of cognitive conditions would be just not being very well educated about the world around you and thus the implications of the agreements that you enter into, and not having much in the way of capacity to think through what the nature of your interests are. The other aspect of this global capacity is the notion of equality of opportunity, okay? In particular, equality of opportunity for refusal of consent or exit. That's going to be, again, we're focusing on the outside option. In other words, if you have a question of how, whether to enter into an agreement or not, and the other person has that similar agreement, these two people are going to face very different, have very different amount of power in their relationship, to the extent that one person has a lot of great options and the other one has very few great options, okay? And the thought is going to be something like, they in some sense there's a failure of equality of opportunity for refusal of consent. What I have in mind by equality of opportunity is a quite robust notion, namely sort of something where you have directly available to you all of these different types of opportunities, at least as a basic background condition, which we can talk more about as we go along. But so the basic conditions for market exchange, for fair market exchange, is that persons enter into that market exchange with these background conditions established by equal capacity or equal cognitive conditions and equal opportunity. That's the kind of the basic standard, I think, by which to evaluate it. Again, there's an analogy, I think, in the case of democracy. In the case of democracy, you've got voting power and various other kinds of political power, but you've also got the capacity to come to an understanding of the issues as they relate to you and what your interests are and what your concerns are. Okay, so those are the two principles. Now, thanks, yeah. The two, I want to just sort of lay this out in terms of two simple kind of contexts. One is, suppose you have an agreement between two persons, where those two persons have to make an agreement which in some sense affects their whole life prospects going forward, okay? So it's a very complex agreement. It's the kind of agreement, for example, that's made in the context in economics with perfectly competitive markets, at least in the Arrow de Breu sort of markets, where you basically make a decision for planning for all time with all different possible eventualities in there. So if you have but if you just have two persons doing this, then you have some possibility of bargaining between them. And so the thought is going to be, well, what you do to make these an equal exchange is going to be make sure that their outside options are of similar value, okay, and make sure that they have the cognitive conditions to address the issues that arise in this exchange. That would be the one-shot case in some sense. The standard case that we face is that each one of us engages in a whole series of agreements that we enter into over the course of our lives, over houses that we buy, jobs that we have, all kinds of relationships that we enter into that are quite complex and that organize our relations with lots of other people simultaneously in many cases. And we enter into a whole series of these kinds of relationships, okay? Now the thought here is that the notion of equal capacity is supposed to form a kind of basic background condition, okay, such that the idea is going to be that in certain contexts, if you make certain agreements with other people, okay, the consequence of those agreements might be that you have subsequently an inequality of opportunity that arises, but that can be a legitimate inequality if it's chosen from a background condition of equality, and it's something that you knowingly choose, okay. But what I want to say is there are going to be a number of different types of cases, I think, where you have legitimate inequalities that arise from agreements that people enter into with each other, and illegitimate inequalities that can arise. And this is going to be part of the, this is some of the complexity that arises into this picture. Now, some inequalities that are generated from our agreements, I think, that we make with each other, like an inequality that if I take a job with somebody and it's a minimum wage or beneath minimum wage job because I have to take it, okay, there the background conditions are such that the agreement that I enter into with this other person is such that we have massively different types of bargaining power, okay? And my thought is then that what arises from that agreement is to that extent not legitimate because of the way it arises. The second kind of way in which you can have a kind of illegitimate inequality arising, and this is trickier, is if you have a case where, well, let me just give kind of a toy case. Imagine a society where there are really two jobs. There are masters and there are slaves, okay, and with all the meaning that comes with that. But at some earlier point in their lives, namely up to the point of their becoming 21 or something like that, each person has an equal opportunity to enter into one of those two positions. Okay, you have an equal opportunity to enter into, and you can figure out you can try to figure out for yourself what they are and so on. But what's going on is the division of labor is fixed so that Most people are going to have to be in the slave position, and a small number of people are going to have to be in the master position. And so they have a kind of competitive inequality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity to enter into one of those positions. Okay. What I want to say is that, and I think the democratic conception helps us understand this, that there's something fundamentally illegitimate about that kind of arrangement. All right. It doesn't, I mean, the extreme case, of course, I think it's going to apply to less extreme cases as well. There's something, even if you have equality of opportunity, if it's the case that the equality of opportunity is just to occupy some position or another, both of which are fixed, okay, then there's a deficiency in the case of the inequality of opportunity. In some sense, what happens is some person is going to have to live with, for most of their lives, less of a say than other people. Okay. Now, I just want to comment on that just very briefly some more, and that is the democratic conception of equality of opportunity now gives us an indication a little bit about what this notion is about. Normally, when we think about equality of opportunity, we think the positions are fixed, and a person has an opportunity to enter into one position or another, and you have something like a race between persons to occupy one of these superior positions. But the democratic conception of equality of opportunity, which is supposed to give you power to shape your social world, the thought is going to be ultimately, the point of it is that you should be able to shape that division of labor. Okay? It shouldn't be fixed in that way. In other words, presumably when you have persons who have some roughly equal power, what they're capable of doing then is not just having an equal race to occupy positions, but they can actually transform the division of labor itself. Okay? So if there's a fixity or rigidity in the division of labor, then there's a problem in the nature of the equality in this case. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit more about this as I talk about markets. So, because I want to apply this idea to the sort of two standard types of cases of markets. One are perfectly competitive markets, and the other are imperfectly competitive markets. And by perfectly competitive, I mean perfectly competitive and complete markets, whereas the other are incomplete markets. Okay? So perfect competition exists when there's no monopoly or monopsony, and there are lots of buyers and sellers, and there are no transaction costs or information costs, and there are no external costs either. Imperfect competition exists in a market when at least some of these conditions don't obtain. So there's monopoly or monopsony because maybe there are increasing returns to scale in the process of production. There are asymmetries of information or lots of transaction costs and so on. Now, I want to say just a few things about perfect competition here, which are of interest here. The thing about perfect competition, I think, and this is not often commented on, there's not very much philosophical reflection on the nature of this really core economic idea of what perfect competition with complete markets amounts to. But the basic idea is that I think it's a kind of or partial ideal of cooperation. Okay, that's what a perfectly competitive market has. I mean, it sounds funny to say that because you've got the term competition in the notion of perfect competition. But competition and perfect competition is not the normal competition that we normally face. Okay, it's not a case where there are winners and losers. It's a case where what happens is there are lots of people offering lots of different things, and each person, as it were, finds their place in a scheme of cooperation. There are no impediments to cooperation because everybody knows what everybody else knows. and there are no costs to transaction. It doesn't cost anything. And there are no, of course, externalities and so on. So what I want to say is that perfect competition realizes a kind of ideal, or part of an ideal of equality and freedom, because, of course, there's no market power in the case of perfect competition. No one can determine the price for other people, okay? There's a kind of universal opportunity. That is, since there are no transaction costs and there's no information asymmetries, each person just goes to the position that they are best suited for in a perfectly competitive market. Okay. There's a significant degree of independence in perfectly competitive markets because insurance and credit are available in some sense in a cost-free way because there are no transaction costs and there's no information asymmetries. The reason why, for example, the poor have a hard time getting credit or insurance is because of information asymmetries. People don't know whether they can pay it off, or they don't know, whether they're a good type or not. So without that kind of information deficit, credit and insurance come very easily. Okay, so in an Arrow-DeBrugge model, you buy options for all possible states of the world, all of them. Okay, and you do it all in one moment for all states of the world, because there are, again, no information or transaction costs. Okay, so you have a kind of fairness there, because you've got this kind of freedom and equality that's in the picture. Of course, it's incomplete because there's the thing about perfectly competitive markets is you can have them and have an unequal distribution or a very bad distribution of initial endowments. That's, of course, what can happen in the case of that's compatible with perfectly competitive markets. And so what I want to say is that even in the case of perfectly competitive markets, though they realize a kind of ideal of cooperation, there is a kind of inequality of power in these markets. Power understood as ability to get what one wants from a group of persons, okay, to the extent that people have different endowments, okay. Yeah, I mean, you can see this with Marx's discussion, right? The people who have no endowments, what do? They sell their labor. People who have a lot of endowments, they buy the labor, and then they don't have to work. And then they get the profit, a large part of the profit from the laborer. I mean, we don't have to agree with the whole description that Marx gives to see that that's a possibility, even under perfectly competitive markets, for there to be tremendous inequalities given the differences in endowments that people have. So what I want to say is these differences in endowments are differences in power. And there are two different ways, I think, in which that can happen. One is, again, think about the kind of picture where you've got a lot of people with no endowments and a bunch of people with a lot of endowments. The people with no endowments are going to sell their labor to the ones with endowments for a lower price, for a lower wage, than if they had a lot of endowment to start with. Okay, so you'd have a change in the wages with a change in the distribution of endowments. Okay. Now, if you think of each person individually, of course, they can't have much effect on the prices or anything like that. But what they can do is work less time if they have a greater endowment. Okay, so they have more options open to them in that sense. So there's a sense even there where the individual has more power if they have a greater endowment. even in a perfectly competitive market where everyone's a price taker. But the second kind of case, I think, is if you just imagine lots of people without endowments and lots of people with endowments. And then you think, well, if those people in one state have no endowments, then they're going to work for these others under a certain wage. But if they have a fairly high endowment, then the wages will change as well. Because though individuals are price takers, if you change the distribution throughout a society, you could actually change the wages as well, okay? And thus you create better conditions for the persons who are doing it. So that's meant to be an argument for the claim that the idea of distribution of power applies in a limited but important way to perfectly competitive markets, okay? Now, what I want to say is, thank you, that, of course, the standard conditions that we face are imperfect, cases of imperfect competition, where there are lots of market imperfections, and there are you have to go, in order to buy something, you have to go to the store or even go to your computer. And then you got to figure out what you want, and you got to think about the different things. These are all transaction costs that don't occur in the case of perfectly competitive markets. But in imperfect markets, they are very important. Furthermore, in imperfect markets, you have some kind of market power that develops. In particular, of course, in the cases of employment relations, you can have monopsony relations where you've got a small set of buyers of labor and a very large set of sellers of labor, where the people who are selling their labor may not have very many endowments, and they also may have some difficulty figuring out what the other jobs are that are available to them, and transaction costs and entering into them and so forth. You can have significant amount of market power between employers and employees in this case, okay? And this has a consequence for their relationships, namely, this has been seen all the way back to the classical theorists like Adam Smith or David Ricardo, that the prices are determined by bargaining and that the surplus is very much distributed in favor of those with market power. All right. So what I want to say here is that in the context of imperfect competition, where you've got market power, particularly between employers and employees, you have something that is similar to, although there's a significant degree of difference, but similar to the case of the master-slave case. I mean, when you have a society where you've got, some people, you have a society that's organized in terms of a small number of buyers of labor and a large number of sellers, the thought is going to be something like, and where the division of labor is in some sense rigidly established like that, you've got a situation where you either fit into one slot or another. Even if you had equal opportunity to get into one of those slots, you still fit into one of those. Now, how can that arise? Well, one is because there's this monopsony relation. The other might be something which a lot of people have pointed to, is that once you have relationships like employer and employee, where the employer is getting more of the rents of the relationship than the employee, okay, then the thought is going to be something like, those people have an interest in keeping that relationship rigid and static, okay, even if in some sense a less inegalitarian relationship would be more productive. Because it might be that they don't get as much under the more productive than under the less productive. So this is a worry that people have had about labor markets, that you could have a kind of rigid division of labor. And the way I'm understanding this is saying when you have this rigid division of labor, even if you have in some sense a kind of equality of opportunity to enter into any of those positions, there's a defect in the whole social relationship, such that you've got an inegalitarian and it violates the democratic principle. Okay. Okay, so that's the case there. So let me just say a few things about some institutions that that can help in this kind of context. So one institution, and the spirit of this is not so much to say, oh, these are great institutions and we should really love them and so on. The spirit of them is to say, okay, we have certain kinds of institutions, let's try to understand what they might be doing, what they might be beneficial. Maybe we can move beyond them to get more of the benefit than we're getting from them, but nevertheless, let's see what they do. So one thing would be the welfare state. And so the traditional view of the welfare state is a kind of Lockean view, which is the welfare state is there because each person has a duty to make sure that other people have their needs met. And so that's what you want to do. But the democratic conception suggests a different kind of picture about the welfare state, which is that what the welfare state is it enables people to have a certain amount of power. Because what it does is it makes the outside option, the option of non-agreement, better for persons. Okay? So in a sense, the creation of a welfare state, maybe a creation of a basic income or unconditional income, is a way of enhancing the power of persons to participate in markets. Okay? It's a way of enhancing that power. It's, in a way, if you think about the democratic analogy, it's a way of giving people voting power or giving them more power to participate in the political process. This is the analog in the market is going to be by improving the outside options of persons, you give them power to participate in the market. Okay. So other kinds of institutional ideas here are, well, one is the regulation of markets, for example, in terms of things like minimum wage or health and safety conditions, and so on. Those are all conditions which, as it were, limit the bargaining power of employers because it decreases their capacity for determining what workers have to live by. Okay, they tend to be very targeted types of ways of limiting that bargaining power, but quite important because, of course, safe working conditions and a decent wage and so on, those can make the difference between a decent life and not a decent life, and they can also make the difference between you're having a good outside option with respect to some other position and the one, and so on. A third kind of thing, which I'm thinking of this as a remedy, or sort of unions and worker participation. Now, what they do is, and here I'm thinking in particular of the idea, what they're doing here is they're rectifying, if you've got a kind of rigid labor market with a rigid division of labor, where some have significant power over others in the way that I described in the case of incomplete markets, these are ways of, in some sense, trying to directly remedy that kind of rigidity. So instead of, instead of the boss being able to determine for you what, all of the conditions of your work, the thought is going to be, no, you have to, in order to have a firm, you're going to have to deal with unions, which enhances the workers' bargaining power, or you're going to have to deal with workers who have a voice in determining what's going on. Okay, or you could have something intermediate like co-determination. These are all the welfare state, that is, these employment regulations and unions and worker participation are all ways of, in some sense, remedying various important inequalities that arise in incomplete markets, I think. So just as a side note here, this is not a general argument for worker participation, because my time is up. I'm almost finished, too. It's a way of, the thought is going to be something like, if you have the more general picture of equality of opportunity, there are going to be people who genuinely desire to have jobs where they don't have a say at all, because they don't want to concern themselves with the subject. They don't want to care about it. They want to go home and think about other things, okay? It's hard to know exactly how many people in the world are like that. Probably most of us are not. But the fact of the matter is, an egalitarian society should leave that option available for people, okay? Second, it's a remedial argument because the thought is going to be, well, under conditions of perfect competition, you don't have the problem that has to be solved, okay? It's not a general argument for worker participation or even unions, but I think it is an argument that has a fair degree of generality in the world as we know it, given the pervasiveness of incomplete and imperfect markets, okay? Okay, so I just wrap it up here. So try to lay out a kind of conception of procedural justice and exchange. It's analogous to the idea of democracy and collective decision-making, and without reducing one to the other, okay. Two, to show that this conception can overcome some of the limits of previous discussions of fairness in markets, and how this conception can shed some light on difficulties in markets that we have, and also how to thinking about the remedies to these difficulties. Those are the kinds of things that I've tried to do and try to suggest that this democratic conception of exchange can help us think through how to think about the fairness of markets. Okay, thank you.